Hi, I'm Jacquie Franciulli for Gators Territory. He's Will Sammon, he's Graham Hahn. We're back here with On the Beat, and we're looking forward to Florida's game against Kentucky. And there's been a lot of talking points already this week. Obviously, Will, Graham, the big talking point is Kadarius Toney will be out for a couple weeks, while CJ Henderson is doubtful for the matchup. Now, Will, let's start with the freshman corners. You had a very extensive piece in how they performed on Saturday against UT Martin. Today, we ran a story on Gators Territory saying how the team is confident in their abilities. Marco Wilson, Donovan Steiner, and Todd Grantham all had great things to say about those three freshmen. What is something that has impressed you about their development?
Well, if you watch them right away, you can tell they're fast, right? I mean, the speed jumps out to you. They make plays. But what really stands out to me is how ready that they appear. It appears that they've been pretty well coached in high school. They kind of know what they're doing. I think Kyrie Elam is like the poster child for that. Obviously, son of an NFL player, nephew of another NFL player. Kid knows what he's doing. He's prepared. But it looked like Chester Kimbrough was also ready to play. He got in the second series, which was a little bit surprising to me to see, even though they did make the mention that, hey, they were going to roll guys through, get them some experience, build that depth up. But even so, I mean, to see him in the second series look ready, make some plays, yeah, he could have been there for another couple of plays, but he flashed enough to make you say to yourself, okay, we know what we have here. If he's called upon, he could probably make something happen. And you can say the same thing about Hill and Elam. The effort was there, so you could kind of judge on that as well. Speed was evident. And again, they're prepared. So I feel like Florida's in a lot better position than they were last year when Marco Wilson went down. So this injury, yeah, it's pretty... You don't want it to happen if you're Florida. It's CJ Henderson. He's the most talented player on your team. But at the same time, you have to recognize that you're in a better position than you were last year for this injury or for something else to happen down the road.
Yeah, and it's actually a tradition for Florida DBs to play as freshmen. And I feel like this Saturday can really be a coming out party for one of these freshman DBs.
Yeah, I think that's very possible. And when we talked to Coach Ron English yesterday, he was kind of being a little coy about what Florida planned to do. I mean, with Brad Stewart's status is still up in the air, although he is expected to be back for the game. And then Jawan Taylor, who missed UT Martin, but should return against Kentucky. Florida really kind of can get creative here. They can move some of these freshman corners inside with Marco on the other side. Marco didn't really play a whole lot against UT Martin, which means that he's going to be totally fresh and expected to probably be out there for the entire time against the Wildcats. And then when you look at safety, Shawn Davis's emergence has really given Florida a weapon to work with in Trey Dean. They don't really have to worry about moving him to safety. He can maintain his role at the star position, especially because Amari Burney's health has been a question mark here for the first 2 weeks of the season. So Florida really benefiting from those freshman DBs, getting some experience, getting in the game early against UT Martin because they're going to play a whole lot of snaps against the Wildcats.
Well, now Amari Burney and Jawan Taylor are expected to play against Kentucky. I know we talked about maybe Trey Dean going at corner since that are experienced. Todd Grantham said that's a possibility, although I think they're going to try to focus on those three freshmen. But Shawn Davis had really grabbed the headlines as well, and you wrote about him and how he really got his confidence back, and that's something they really focused on Shawn Davis because English said that he didn't have that confidence. He sometimes stuttered a little bit because he didn't want to make a play because he thought he was failing at a play.
Yeah, it's really perception versus reality. When you think of the University of Florida, you think of so many great defensive backs that played as freshmen. Janoris Jenkins, Vernon Hargraves, just some recent ones. When you're a highly touted former four-star prospect, sometimes people can label you a bust or an underachiever at best if you aren't making an impact as a freshman, or in Shawn Davis's case, didn't really make an impact until his junior season, his third season on campus. When we talked to Ron English last night, he was saying that a lot of that was a loss of confidence, which is something that people have talked about, which obviously there's a lot of factors for that. When you go through a coaching change, when you go through multiple injuries, when you see yourself kind of usurped on the depth chart by guys that come in the program sometimes after you, that can make you doubt your abilities. And when you've played this game your entire life, that can really kind of be devastating for guys. So to see Shawn Davis get that back and make contributions the way that they know that he have, and that's really been the talking point from Ron English, is that they know that Shawn Davis has had it all along. It's just getting him to believe, and now that he's believing, Florida has another weapon at safety, and really a position that's dire right now considering the health status that we just touched on.
You talked about injuries could be devastating. That was not the case for Jacob Copeland. He's had several injuries since his arrival in Gainesville, but Felipe Franks put it best. He showed grit and determination to come back and play in full health. We saw his capabilities on Saturday, and with Kadarius Toney out, he would be the next man up. Now, Dan Mullen has been a little hesitant to say that he will have more reps, and you can understand why, because he does have a veteran wide receiver group: Freddie Swain, Josh Hammond. All those guys can fit in the slot well. But you wrote a little bit about Copeland, and I did as well, and it seemed like his teammates are very confident in his abilities, and I know Gator Nation is very confident in his abilities. What do you think of Jacob Copeland? Do you feel like he will see more snaps come Saturday, or is it a slow progression to get him out there more?
I think you probably nailed it when you said a kind of a slow progression. I don't expect him to kind of all of a sudden be inserted onto the field and then we see the Jacob Copeland era. It's like that's not really necessarily going to happen. I feel like, it could happen. Could happen. You never know, but highly doubt that that's going to just emerge like that when we watch the Kentucky game on Saturday. A lot of it because of like what you said. I mean, the spread offense is predicated on obviously spreading the ball around, getting more guys involved. If you look at the stat sheet right now, you see 3 or 4 guys already with close to or over 100 yards receiving. Granted, they played against not the best competition there, although Miami has a pretty good defense. Skyhawks, not necessarily the team that you think of when you think of elite defenses. But Jacob Copeland has the tools, but he's still learning the offense. That's really what it comes down to. So for me, it's like, what's going to be his mindset after this happens, whatever it is that happens? If he plays, what's that going to look like? If he doesn't play, what's going to be his mindset? How is he going to react one way or the other?
I will say I've been pumping up Copeland a lot on our board since maybe like the spring or the fall camp, just because I've been interested to see how he plays. I agree with you. I think he still needs to learn the offense. You saw a little bit that he looked towards the veteran guys on Saturday a little bit to make sure he was in the right position. So I get that, but I think his talent and skill is really, really good, and I think he brings that X factor to the offense. I know Kadarius Toney is a very electrifying guy, but I think what Jacob Copeland brings that Kadarius Toney might not bring is he will sometimes follow the play a little bit better scripted, so you will have extra blockers back in the backfield. So I think that's something that I do like Jacob Copeland a little bit, but I'm not comparing both of them because you can't. They're both separate players, something that Dan Mullen has said, and other guys as well. But obviously, the big talking point, too, is Saturday's game. This is retribution for Florida. They lost against the Wildcats last season. Graham, I look at the Kentucky roster, and I see a defensive line that is veteran. That is a veteran defensive line that is very talented. And some argue that it's Mark Stoops' best defensive line to date. The O-line for Florida is doing well in pass blocking. However, they have failed to really give that push that they need to get the running game going, and also the tight ends have failed in some of their assignments for blocking. Do you feel like that is one of the key matchups on Saturday? I
think it possibly could be. I mean, it's interesting that you note how I think veteran that defensive line is of the Wildcats, considering they lost Josh Allen now with the Jaguars. I think that when you look around, you don't expect that to be the case, but certainly that's going to be a constant for Florida all season. I mean, you look at Miami, probably the strength of that team was their front seven. That's going to be the case probably for Auburn. When you look at what Marlin and those guys are doing up there, I think that's something Florida's going to have to get used to. I thought that the offensive line adjusted well against UT Martin. I think the first half, if you would just watch the first half, you would have thought that there were a lot more problems. Once they really adjusted to that 3-3-5 that UT Martin was running, I think that they did much better. That really was, I think, a key point. And when you saw Dan Mullen coming out after the game and talking about how he wasn't happy in the first half, I think a lot of that was on the offensive line, just little technique stuff. And I think he even gave an example there on Monday about what the offensive line needs to do. So I think it's going to be a case of last year where the offensive line, they need to be tested because it's a trial by fire situation. The more that they are tested, the better that they're going to get. And the key for Florida is to get as much experience before you really get into that October stretch that's going to define your season, Jackie. Yeah,
it's all about reps when it comes to the O-line. But, Will, what do you feel like is the main matchup that we're looking for against Kentucky? Do you feel like that trench matchup is one of the keys, or do you feel another matchup that you really want to see?
It is, but you want Felipe Franks to try to pick apart that secondary, because Mark Stoops, his specialty is the secondary. That's what he's made his career on over the years. But they had experienced a lot of turnover this going into this year. And so if you want to see Felipe Franks really make a move and really sort of convince people, put to rest a lot of doubt, you got to see him do a little bit of what he did last week against Kentucky, because completing all those passes behind the line of scrimmage against UT Martin, great. Not trying to take anything away from him, but big but there, it was UT Martin, right? That's what everybody's going to point to. Have a game Not, of course, like that, but similar, where people are no longer questioning your decision-making, that would be wonders for Florida's offense, I feel like. So that's really what I'd be paying attention to. That, in addition to starting that run game, because that's really a key for me, is they have to get that going, and that would allow Felipe Franks to have a little bit off of his shoulders, too.
Yeah, and I still remember that Miami game. I wish they had more of those one-on-one matchups that they were trying to go towards the end of that game. I feel like the height advantage that Florida has outside with those wide receivers and tight ends, they should really take advantage of that.
I mean, he missed them, too, in that Miami game. I think the first throw of the game was to Van Jefferson, and I think he tried to compensate for like wanting to put the ball only where Van Jefferson can get it, and even Van Jefferson couldn't get that one because it was out of bounds. So, those are the things that he has to take advantage of, because that was a one-on-one matchup. Obviously, it was just one time. But I think they're going to see a little bit of that against Kentucky, which makes it a little bit tricky because they do mix their coverages up. They play a little bit of man and zone at the same time. So it's a good test for him as far as the ability to make reads and make good decisions early on.
Now, when you see this game play out, injuries on both sides, obviously Terry Wilson is out for the season for Kentucky. You've got Kadarius Toney out, C.J. Henderson most likely out. How do you see this matchup play out? Do you feel like Florida can go into Lexington and get their first true road win of the season?
I do. I think that this is obviously a much different Kentucky team, even though what you said, that defensive line could give Florida some fits. If they struggle to contain and hold their blocks early in that game, it could get kind of ugly, especially if we see more of the Florida that we saw in that first game, that 4 turnover performance, the sloppy penalties down the stretch. If that's the Florida that comes out in Lexington, then Florida's really going to struggle and could end up suffering consecutive losses to the Wildcats. But that's not what I see happening. I think that Florida's going to go in there, take care of business. I think they win 31-14, and Florida starts the season 3-0, and they return back to Gainesville with a lot of promise. And I think this is a team that is going to continue to prove people wrong. You saw them fall in the polls, rise back up after this win. What Will was saying earlier, the key question for me right now is, what is Felipe Franks going to do? What's it going to take for him to really change the conversation, turn the tide, and start turning the national dialogue towards this is a guy who actually is a good quarterback, not a guy who is starting to come around after a rough start to his collegiate career. This is a guy that I think we've started to see enough of, is a very solid, if not a top 5 SEC quarterback, and I think that if he goes out in Lexington and has a performance like he did, like Will said, against UT Martin, you'll start to see that national dialogue shift a little bit.
So what we haven't had the question is, how do you feel like starting a new streak against Kentucky? We haven't had that question how you predicted earlier this week, but what do you predict about this game?
Yeah, I mean, you got to look at the schedule and say to yourself, where does this game sort of rank for Florida? And for me, it's probably their 5th toughest game. Off the top of my head, I'm going to go, LSU, Georgia, of course. Those are 2 right away. Auburn's right there. And then I think Missouri comes a little bit before Kentucky because that's on the road. That looks like a pretty tough team. But Kentucky's right there. It's on your better part of the schedule. So you're asking for yourselves to play the best game that you possibly can because it's on the road. You got to do everything right to win this game. So I'm expecting it to be pretty close, actually. I'm looking at probably like a 1-score game, probably something around 24-17 Florida.
I actually agree with you. I was actually going to, agree with Will. Sorry, Graham. And actually, my score is actually identical to yours. That's how I was believing. I just feel the same thing with you right now. There are a lot of questions still on this team. I just feel like UT Martin, although they played well in certain aspects, they didn't come out as sharp as I thought they should have against the Skyhawks. And Dan Mullen did say that he didn't have a not-so-friendly halftime talk with them. So I feel like this game, I still have questions I still haven't had answered in the Miami game or UT Martin. I still think they're going to win, but it's not going to be as easy as some people think. Well, thanks everybody for watching again, and obviously stay with Gators territory as we continue to count down to the big matchup in Lexington. For Will and Graham, thanks for watching.